Hey guys, I'm just going to preface by saying I'm really, really excited. I really am. I mean, I'm looking forward to DS9, don't mistake me, but there's a personal connection I've had to TNG for a long time, which I'm going to talk about here in brief for a bit. I'm really hyped. Some of you already know this. About 4 years and around 2 months ago, from my perspective right now, I sat down and started rewatching Star Trek The Next Generation. I got several episodes into season one, like maybe 5, 6 episodes in, and then I was like, wait, I want to do a rumination on this series for the show. Now, this was back before I was really on Patreon or had, supporters or was really doing it as my primary job. It was just something I wanted to do. So, and I say that to give you the idea that when I was doing that, along with the Voyager stuff, it was something I did because I wanted to do it. And by happy coincidence, plenty of people were willing to fund me continuing to do these ruminations so I could finish the Voyager series and now do the TNG series. But I want to mention that because I've been waiting 4 years and about 2 months to rewatch TNG. That's how long I've been holding back on this. I have the Blu-rays, so I'll be going through the Blu-ray version. But I want to talk about that really quick, too, because some people have asked why. Why hold yourself back? Now, when I go back through a fictional work in analysis mode, as I like to call it, my opinion on things almost universally changes. It's extremely rare that I go through something and I have the exact same opinion that I did walking into it. Now, most of the time, this is just a drift. More positive, more negative, when I already was positive or negative. Occasionally it's a shift in perspective, like, well, I appreciate this and this, but I no longer like this and that, that kind of a thing. But the other thing I've noticed, and I noticed this even then, and of course this is even more important, this is one of the reasons why I've continued to not rewatch TNG until we are here now, finally, at the TNG Ruminations, is because it gives me a different mentality when I go into it. It helps me to further divorce myself from my own past bias and vague memories when I go back through a work and really reanalyze it right after seeing it or right after playing it, or in some cases right after reading it. So if I had rewatched TNG 4 years ago, I would have that bias just sitting there, which might or may color or affect my opinions. I want to be as clean slate as possible going through these things. So that's the main reason I did that. Now, if you'll forgive my indulgence, the year is 1986 or 85, somewhere around there. And a young boy really loves his mom, right? This was pretty recent after the divorce, and I've always been pretty defensive, protective when it comes to mom, and she and I have always had friendship in addition to just a biological connection. So one of the things that used to happen a lot was I would try to find interests that she liked that I also liked. This is actually something that would continue for many, many years. Every time I found a video game, for example, that she actually enjoyed, I would be like, yes, because now we could do something together and both enjoy it. Now that was really important to me. Even as a kid, I remember this. It was very important that she not just be humoring me, but she had to actually enjoy it. So Mom used to like to unwind after coming home from work to this show. And you probably already know where this is going, so forgive me for those of you who have already even heard this story or can guess. And I remember distinctly, first time I sat down and decided, just sat down right next to the chair, and just kind of leaned up against the chair and watched it with her. And there were these guys on like a giant desert or something like that, and they were trying to escape, and something wasn't letting them escape, and there was all these issues, and there were these glowing eyes in the distance, and it was really creepy. And then there was this thing where they were like, "Oh God, we're going to get shot by these guns." And I even at that age, I was like, "No," because both Mom and Dad were very open and overt with gun safety education, even when I was very, very young. So I'm like, "No, you can't do that. They're gonna get shot, Mom." It's okay. I think they have a plan. Okay. Now, anybody who knows Star Trek, which is probably 100% of the people listening to me right now, knows that I'm referring to the episode Spectre of the Gun from the original series. That was my very first exposure to Star Trek ever. First thing I ever saw was that rerun of Spectre of the Gun when I was pretty young. I don't remember a lot about the details of anything other than the episode and the way Mum was reacting and the way I felt after it, which was, Wah! I didn't like it, in short. And so I was like, no! But remember, I really wanted to like the same things Mum liked. So I gave it another shot. And I know the next 3 episodes I saw. They were Doomsday Device, Balance of Terror, and A Piece of the Action. 3 episodes that I consider to be some of the better episodes of Star Trek original series to this day. And that got me hooked, especially Balance of Terror. Something about the what I didn't at the time didn't know was the submarine-style tension military drama really caught my attention. And I was like, oh yeah, this is great. I was way into it. And so I started watching all sorts of Star Trek with Mom for the next couple of years, give or take. It was around 2 years that we were doing that and just watching old reruns of Star Trek. It wasn't a regular thing because they didn't run them regularly. I know some of you know what I'm talking about. Probably most of you watching this. Some of you might not, though. Back in the day, TV... Back in my day... No, seriously, we didn't have cable, right? Local broadcast stations had reels that they would run pretty much whenever. And then, of course, other things would take priority. And some things that were new and recent would have a schedule. But for reruns, that was basically a whenever thing. And it would be very rare that they would run reruns in order. It was just, let's put an episode of Star Trek on at like noon on a Saturday, that kind of a thing. So every now and again, we'd sit down in front of our terrible TV. The screen was like about this big. The TV was closer to this big. Actually, it's actually closer to this, but this is getting off the webcam here. And we'd just sit back and watch and enjoy it. It was good. I loved it. September 1987. I have distinct memories of this because Mom was so excited. She had just found out from a friend at work there was going to be a new Star Trek. Now, at the time, I didn't really have a context for this. Looking back, I'm not 100% sure how new or innovative this was, but even not knowing the specifics, Star Trek was among the first, or one of the very few, to actually be canceled and then actually be brought back into a new show. To continue in such a manner like this as a franchise was a very new idea back then. Again, I'm not sure if it was literally the first. I know Doctor Who came back and went away a few times, and there's a few other shows and franchises that kind of did that as well. But for at the time, especially for Mum and for myself, this was unheard of. The idea that we were getting a new Star Trek show was mind-blowing. Even as a kid, I understood just enough to understand this was a big deal. And this was a big moment, and Mum was super excited. And I actually got to stay up late to watch the premiere, and we set up. This is actually we had a new television now, bigger screen. Still kind of an old crappy television, but what do you want? It's 87, and so we're sitting there. We had popcorn, we had candy, we had drinks. We were just sitting there like, oh my God, and this is it. This is going to be the new Star Trek, and I was so excited about it. And then Encounter at Farpoint played, and I'd love to tell you what my reaction was to it, but to be completely honest, I don't really remember. But you know what I do remember? I remember every Friday or whatever it was, I don't remember the day, forgive me, but every day a new Star Trek would come out for the next, oh God, like 15 years, something like that. Me and Mum would sit down, whatever else, we always made sure there was room, and we'd sit down together and we'd watch the new episode of Star Trek, and that was a regular thing for most of my growing up life. We went through TNG together, we went through most of DS9 together. You'll hear more about that tomorrow. We went through all of Voyager together. Some of Enterprise. And that's probably the biggest reason why Star Trek has always remained such a huge influence on me as a person. Obviously, I'm a pretty big Star Trek fan. I think that's fairly self-apparent. It's one of the very few franchises I feel comfortable sitting down and talking about without rehearsing or taking... I have no notes. I don't need notes. I will be taking notes, of course, for the rumination, but my point is, if you walked up to me on the street and said, tell me what you think about Lonely Among Us, tell me what you think about Best of Both Worlds. Tell me what you think about Redemption. Tell me what you think about Bonded. or First Contact, the show, not the episode, not the movie, I could turn around and just start talking with you about that because it's just right there. And I was lucky, too. In, God, I don't remember which grades, to be completely honest. I know where I was living. I think that would have been 7th and 6th grades, and possibly 5th. I had the great fortune of having two really awesome friends, Vincent and Joel, who I've actually referenced before, who were really big into Star Trek. And my dad liked Star Trek, too. So I had the great fortune of being able to share my love of something with other people around me, with my friends and with my family. And that was awesome. Me and Dad and me and Mom went to several conventions. I've talked about this as we're going through the Voyager, all the Star Trek conventions that I used to regularly go to, that unfortunately I just don't have the time and money to do anymore. I still would if I could. And the ideas of sharing and bouncing ideas off each other. I didn't realize it at the time, but my enjoyment of Star Trek was emphasized by the fact that I wasn't thinking of it in a vacuum. It's one of the reasons I prefer doing live Ruminations to just sitting down and playing a game without any stream audience, because the more we bounce ideas back and forth, the more fleshed out, the more in-depth, the better those ideas become. And I had that benefit while I was going through TNG and DS9 and Voyager and so forth. The next thing I remember about Star Trek, about TNG in specific, is that it was the beginning of two aspects of my own personal perspective when it comes to fiction. The first would be characters. It was the first time that I really cared about the characters in a fictional work. Like, I really dug the individuals. Anybody who knows my 5 points of story knows that 2 of them are specifically devoted to characters, characterization, and character growth, more commonly referred to as story arcs, or character arcs, excuse me. And there's something to be said about the fact that of this, that's the percentage here. And I will endure or tolerate a story that has weak plot, non-existent setting, or disinteresting theme, if it still has really strong characterization. And all of that really began with TNG, because even in Season 1, while there are definitely some hiccups, and we'll be talking about that as we go through, these characters made me care about them. The combination of the writing and the acting and the directing all made me want to know what's going to happen. I was worried about Data, and I was concerned about how Geordi was going to deal with that stupid probe that just keeps attacking him. And, oh my God, is Worf going to be okay? I mean, he just got injured, and oh God, what's Troy going through? I cared about these characters, and this was the first time for me that was a thing. And I think that's one of the reasons TNG has lasted so long in my mind, compared to a arguably better constructed and better written and better presented and better directed show like Deep Space Nine. It's actually one of the main reasons why when I sit, everyone says, what's your favorite Star Trek? And mine usually is TNG and DS9, basically tied. Those two are just right there together. And a lot of that sits on the immense strength of TNG's characters and their dynamic between each other, and the fact that while people tend to make fun of TNG and obviously point out the lack of continuity or the strong story focus or story arcs, TNG never really shied away from really going to bat for certain issues or certain concepts. And in many cases it did so without soapboxing, which has always spoken clearly to me as an individual. So, now, of course, TNG does soapbox sometime, let's make that clear. But, point remaining, if you sit back and look at the aggregate of TNG, there is an enormous amount of great there, and good. And then these spikes of bad that go throughout it, obviously. I'm not trying to say TNG is perfect, quite the contrary. And I will not be holding back as ever. But that brings me to my next point. TNG is when I learned that fiction can make mistakes. Now that may sound stupid, but I want you to think of it from 8-year-old me's, or God, I don't remember how old I was at the time. It was 6-year-old, 7-year-old me's perspective, okay? It takes a lot of time and money and people to go ahead and put together something like a television show and put it out there. And I knew that even then. I didn't know specifics, although this is probably where my interest in television and television productions really began, was also with TNG, so that's another part of it that's relevant to my life. But I knew that there was a lot that went into it, and it was costly, it took a bunch of people, so if I, a stupid kid, could notice a flaw or a genuine plot hole or a mistake or where something just doesn't add up or make sense, well, then obviously they could. I mean, that's just duh, right? And so what do you think's more likely? That hundreds of people working together on a professional business who do for a living sit down and make television and write fiction could make a mistake, or that I, the stupid kid, was just missing something? So for a long time there, about 2.5, 3 years, I assumed the problem was with me, and that I was just missing something. And it was specifically through TNG's run and on TNG that I slowly began to learn that, no, that's not how real life works, unfortunately. But I argue even to this day that my previous logical argument does make a fair amount of sense, logically speaking. I mean, what's more likely, right? It's also one of the reasons why when I hear someone, because I've heard this even as recent as the modern day, when someone levies a complaint, you've never made a game, why do you have the right to ruminate on them? Because I can think. I don't really need credentials here. Although I have been doing this for like 6 years at this point. So I guess I have credentials now? I don't know. Whatever. It doesn't really matter. The point being that TNG taught me about characters, TNG taught me about television productions, and TNG taught me that fiction can be wrong, can make mistakes. TNG is also probably when my love of ships really started to come into the fore, although that was kind of more of a Star Wars thing than Star Trek, but I digress. Now, I want to talk about a couple of other things before we really get to the main meat of things, which will actually be happening next week. First of all, there's something weird about the 80s and the 70s. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's drugs. I don't know. I don't do drugs. I've never done drugs, so I don't have experience, so I can't comment on them, as we just discussed. But with all sincerity, all joking aside, there's something I've noticed when analyzing works that came out in the 70s and 80s, in that we don't really know what happened in a lot of cases. It was a weird point in history. People weren't documenting everything as rigorously as had been done in the past. We actually know more about fictional works from the 30s and 40s and 50s, primarily thanks to the Second World War and the First World War, and the effect that had on the public, at least here in the States, the public conscious need to make sure we document as much as possible. That was a thing. You can look it up if you don't know what I'm talking about. I don't know what it's called, so forgive me. But then in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, that just kind of dropped off for some reason. And I don't fully understand why, unless it was literally just a pendulum, swinging the other way with regards to what I just discussed. And I've noticed this when it comes to comic books, I've noticed this when it comes to video games, and I've noticed this when it comes to movies as well, and television, obviously. There's certain things we just don't know. Now, I know what you guys are going to say, and I'm sure there's plenty of Trekkers, Trekkies, and whatever other Trek fans you want to call yourself out there. Let me just say that whatever you're going to say, there's a pretty good chance that I've already read it myself. I have the magazines. I'll be using them just like I did with Voyager. I'll be having access to Shatner's documentary. I need to actually do another fine-tooth comb run-through of that. Tons of interviews, tons of convention things. Here's where the problem really comes into focus, especially for early TNG. This is where it's really bad. Early TNG, first 3 seasons of TNG, which is the 80s, there's contradictory reports. So if I say something, or if I share something with you, I don't want to preface it every single time I say something with maybe such and such, or possibly such and such. So please do me a favor and just assume, especially for the first 2 to 3 seasons, that there's that automatic asterisk of this might be incorrect information, because a lot of the things that people say contradicts the things that other people say. There's only a couple of cases where I really feel I can weigh in on those and say, well, I think it's more likely such and such. I think it's more likely this side of the argument rather than this one. There will be something regarding Will Wheaton that'll be about that, something regarding Terry Farrell I'll be mentioning as well. A couple of other things. So I just want to mention that because there's a lot of stuff we just don't know. And that brings me to my next point. If you... I don't want to push anyone away from my show, but I don't put Roddenberry on a pedestal. I have no problem speaking ill of the man, regardless of the fact that he did amazing things and that he's dead. I'm just saying that as bluntly as I can, because I've noticed in real life that when someone passes on, how we talk about them afterwards changes kind of weirdly. Like sometimes we swing way positive and be like, oh my God, praise, praise, when they were being vilified, shortly before their death. Sometimes we swing way the other way and just start trying to demonize them. Oh, they were horrible people. And then sometimes it goes back and forth between the two, right? And I've noticed that people will do that. I will not. I will be speaking about Mr. Roddenberry and what I feel about him legitimately based on what information I have, which may or may not be accurate, and my own opinions on the matter. Not regarding the fact that he is no longer among us, and not regarding the fact that he did an amazing thing by bringing us Star Trek. Anybody who watches Star Wars or watched any of my Star Wars stuff knows I don't put Lucas on a pedestal any more than I put Roddenberry on a pedestal. Just want to be nice and clear about that. It doesn't mean I'm going to yell at him and tell him horrible, but I'm going to be as honest and open as I basically always am when it comes to this show. I'm really, really excited to go back through this show. I'm genuinely like sitting here like, oh God, I can't wait to... I mean, even Encounter of Farpoint, which I don't remember particularly fondly, I'm like, yeah, it's going to be great. So I really hope you guys will enjoy going through this with me, and I will see you next time.